Well, there's a lot. I mean, what you just outlined really covers it pretty well. But the thing I think that's important to the listeners is to know that Frank Olson was actually one of the very first employees, one of the very first scientists to be hired at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland. Fort Detrick is the biological warfare center for the United States Army. And virtually everything that's done in terms of biological warfare or chemical warfare is conducted at Fort Detrick and its sister installation at Fort Edgewood, Maryland, which isn't too far away. But Olson was one of the very first, I think the third employee to be hired there. The reason he was hired is because the man that had been picked by the President of the United States to head up Fort Detrick, which was being built at the time, had been Frank Olson's thesis professor at the University of Wisconsin. And when Olson had been his student in biochemistry, and this man was very impressed with Olson, and so he telephoned him after he was picked to commandeer Fort Detrick and asked Olson if he needed a job. And at that time, Olson did need a job, and he packed up his family and drove from Indiana to actually it was from Texas, I'm sorry, to Maryland, and was there on the ground floor as Fort Detrick developed, and eventually had over 5,000 employees.
There you go. So, what was his credentials? So was he a microbiologist or something like that, or did he just have a background in biology?
By training, Olson was a microbiologist. He, at the time that he was hired, he was only about a year and a half out of university, so he didn't really have a lot of hard and fast experience. And because there was the Second World War was underway when he was hired, he really had to hit the ground running. And at the time that he was hired and that Fort Detrick was being developed, the whole concept of biological warfare was very, very new to the United States, and for that matter to the world. This was 1942, 1943. And there had been during the First World War, there had been a number of gas attacks, mostly with mustard gas. But at the time that Olson arrived to Fort Detrick, the transition was being made from chemical warfare to biological warfare. So a lot of very scary and frightening things were being considered at that time. Fort Detrick eventually, within a year of Olson's hiring, was manufacturing anthrax. A lot of that was done in consultation and in cooperation with the British government, with scientists at Porton Down. And in addition to anthrax, they were studying virtually every lethal or toxic disease known to man. And actually going down the entire list and initially cataloging them, and then making an effort to determine, which diseases could be used in warfare. And through that process, it was mostly coincidental that they came upon LSD. LSD had been discovered I think right at the beginning of the Second World War in Basel, Switzerland. It had been discovered in the laboratories of Sandoz, the Sandoz Chemical Company, and it was known at that time it was known to a very small clique of scientists worldwide, maybe about a total of 12 scientists. And at the time of its initial discovery, it was noted as a wonder drug, but nobody really knew why it was a wonder drug. Nobody really knew how it could be applied to the concept of warfare. Yet there was a huge bandwagon developed around the drug, and for about 10 years from the late 40s, from 1949 until the mid-60s, there was a tremendous amount of research that was conducted in the United States with LSD to the tune of about $35 million. $35 million was spent by the Central Intelligence Agency alone in regards to LSD research, and $35 million in the 1950s was a tremendous amount of money. Tremendous amount of money. And Olson's laboratory within the Fort Detrick compound was called the Special Operations Division, which was the most secret division in all of Fort Detrick. And they worked under contract with the CIA, which was basically developing as an organization practically at the same time as Fort Detrick and the Special Operations Division. And there was an alliance formed between the CIA and Frank Olson's laboratory that was codenamed MK-Naomi. MK were two initials that were actually tracking initials that were used for domestic drug programs, and Naomi was the code name for the project. It was reported to be the name of a secretary of a prominent doctor who was on board with the whole program from the very beginning. That was Dr. Harold Abramson of New York City, who was one of America's most prominent research scientists in the early research of LSD.
So, really, really interesting. And so, do you know if Frank then directly worked and experimented himself with LSD? And because we, there have been so many documentaries as well produced on the CIA and the connection with LSD and some of the experimentation, of course, that the military did on some of their own personnel. This was, filmed, recorded in different ways. It's been posted on the web and so forth. But do you know if Frank was directly involved with some of this experimentation as well?
Yes, Frank was very much involved, very, very much directly involved, both through the Army, which conducted their own LSD experiments for approximately 15 years, and with the CIA under contract, which was also conducting LSD experiments across America with a number of research institutions, colleges, universities, and they opened a number of what they called safe houses in New York City and San Francisco, where people were literally brought in off the street, sometimes through the use of prostitutes, and were drugged with LSD and filmed and observed by scientists. As strange as that sounds, it really happened quite often. The Army, which was Olson's employer, Olson was actually a civilian employee of the Army, from approximately 1950 until about 1967, conducted experiments on 6,700 U.S. soldiers with LSD, of which nobody really has any of the names any longer, and there was no follow-up studies done with any of those soldiers. The experiments were really, really sloppy. There's a few films that people can find on the internet that show squadrons or platoons of soldiers marching under the influence of LSD, and to watch the films, it's really quite amusing. But in a lot of cases, it wasn't amusing or funny at all. A lot of individual soldiers were deliberately induced to take LSD. They had no idea what they were doing. They were told they were being given an experimental drug in a glass of water. But the effects were horrendous, and there were a large number of people that temporarily went insane. There were some that permanently went insane, and there were a number of troops that actually committed suicide later on because they had no idea what had provoked what they considered to be a horrible experience.
You know, I recall, I think it was Allen